question is, it's not, do you understand this? The question is, what are you going to do about it? In 2003, about 70,000 people gathered in a field in Maine for a fish festival called It. Now, I know what you're thinking. Hippies, drugs, dancing, sure. But something happened in one of the late night sets that I've never ever been able to stop thinking about. The band played a song called Ghost for about 45 minutes. And somewhere in the middle of it, something shifted. People stopped doing their own thing and started looking at each other. There was this sense, it's hard to describe, of direct communication. Like everyone had suddenly plugged in wires into each other and realized that they could communicate or something like that. Some people were crying, some people were celebrating. Um, People were doing all kinds of things, and from what I could tell, thousands of people experienced something transcendent together. And then they went home. They talked about it online, but none of them did anything with it. Thousands of people saw the same thing, felt the same thing, and almost none of them acted on it. That's the 0.001% problem. And it's the most uncomfortable idea in my novel. Echo chamber. It's the ultimate dismissal in modern discourse. If the people around you agree with you, you must be doing something wrong. You must be in a bubble and you must be filtering out dissent. The assumption underneath that is disagreement equals intellectual health. If smart people disagree, that's a sign of healthy discourse. But if smart people agree, then that's suspicious. That's groupthink, and that's an echo chamber. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if on some questions, the smart people should agree? What if disagreement isn't a sign of intellectual health, but a sign that someone in the room is wrong? And, what if, and here's the uncomfortable part, what if the people who see clearly don't just agree with each other, but then naturally find each other? Not because they're seeking validation, but because clarity is rare and people who have it recognize each other. So here's the question that nobody wants to ask. What if some chambers echo truth? What if the reason everyone in your bubble agrees isn't because you've filtered out dissent, but because you've filtered out for accuracy? What if the disagreement you're supposed to seek out would actually make you less correct, not more? This is the 0.001% problem, and it starts with a distinction that nobody makes. Let's go back to that fish concert. Thousands of people saw something. They all talked about it online. They experienced a moment of transcendence, connection, whatever you want to call it. The experience was real. The perception was shared. But almost none of them acted on it. Why? Because seeing and acting are completely different capacities. The capacity to perceive truth, to see clearly, to understand something before the evidence is overwhelming, that's one thing. And, this is what nearly everyone prides themselves on. You see it all over YouTube, you see it on X, and many people even make an entire living from it. However, the capacity to act on that perception, to change your behavior, to reorganize your life, and do something about what you've seen is something else entirely. And, here's the brutal mathematics. The second capacity is much, much, much rarer than the first. Think about it in your own life. How many people do you know who understand intellectually that they should, exercise more, eat better, save more money, leave that relationship, start that project, whatever it is, Most people you know, probably, they understand that, but understanding isn't the bottleneck. How many of them actually do it? That's the gap. That's the 0.001%. It's not the percentage who can see, it's the percentage who see and act, who don't just understand what needs to happen, but actually reorganize their lives around that understanding. So let's say, for the sake of argument, just for the sake of argument, that all 70,000 people saw something transcendent in that field. They probably didn't. Um, you know, I don't know the actual number. But let's just say it was that. Maybe 70 then actually changed anything at all because of it. That's 0.1%, and I'm being generous. The real number, the people who genuinely integrated that experience and let it transform how they live, probably closer to 0.001%. 7 people out of 70,000. And again, the 70,000 figure is probably wrong, so it may have just been 1. Now let's talk about what this means for how we think about agreement and disagreement. The standard view, the echo chamber critique, assumes that epistemic competence is evenly distributed, that for any given question, people who disagree, they're probably about equally likely to be right. But that's empirically false. On complex questions that require specialized knowledge, unusual perception, willingness to update on evidence, epistemic competence is wildly unevenly distributed. Okay? Think about the history of science. At any given moment, there were a handful of people who saw clearly what was happening: Darwin, Einstein, Shannon, and then vast majorities who did not. The majorities weren't stupid, they just maybe haven't done the work, or didn't have the capacity, or weren't willing to accept the implications, whatever. Were Darwin's correspondents an echo chamber in that situation? The small group of naturalists who understood evolution before it was widely accepted? Or were they just right before everyone else caught up? So here's the uncomfortable implication of that. If you're someone with genuine epistemic competence, if you've done the work, developed the models, learned to see clearly, then the people who agree with you aren't necessarily a bubble. They might be the only other people who see what you can see. And the disagreement you're supposed to seek out, it might just be noise. It would be possibly well-meaning noise sometimes, but just it's noise. Now, this is why truth is not democratic. All right? Consensus doesn't make something true. 1,000 people believing something false doesn't make it more true than one person believing something accurate. And more importantly, 1,000 people not acting on something true doesn't make the few people who do act somehow suspicious. It makes them the 0.001%. In the Quamhoc Anomaly, this isn't subtext, it's the actual thesis. The protagonist and his crew, Alias, Chris, Pat, Shauna, Raiden, they fight constantly. They clash over methods, they argue about ethics, they tear each other apart over how to survive. But the catch is, they never argue about reality. They agree on big things, the fundamental things. They see the same truths, they acknowledge the same patterns, but they bet on completely different futures. And if you're trained by conventional narrative, this looks wrong. Where's the epistemic conflict? Where's the character who says, maybe we're seeing this wrong, and then turns out to be right? It's not there. And that's by design. Because the novel's thesis is that people who see clearly naturally converge on the truth. The conflict isn't, is this real? The conflict is, what the hell do we do now? The characters who genuinely disagree, they leave or they become antagonists. There's a character named Marcus who, he can't handle what the group is seeing. He's not stupid, he just can't act on it. So he exits. He goes back to his life, chooses comfort over clarity. And then there's Kira, the most dangerous character in the book, who sees exactly what Alias sees. Same data, same clarity, but she makes a different choice about what to do with it. She becomes the architect of the system that they're fighting against. She's not wrong about what she sees. That's the horror. She and Alias are looking at the same truth. Most people want a cage. Most people want to trade freedom for comfort. Most people will not act, no matter what they see. They agree on this. Alias's response, though, build a lifeboat for the 0.001% who will act. Kira's response is give the majority what they want, build the cage, make it comfortable. Same perception, different values. And, that's a much more interesting conflict than protagonist is wrong and then learns to be humble. The book explicitly calls them collaborators at some point. The same conscious agents playing a different hand of cards, so to speak. They're not opposites, they're inversions. So what does this mean? If the 0.001% thesis is correct, if the people who see clearly naturally converge, and the disagreement we're told to seek is mostly noise, well then what are the implications of that? Well, for democracy, uncomfortable. Democracy assumes that aggregating opinions predicts wisdom. But if most people can't or won't act on truth, then aggregating opinions just produces comfortable lies. For online discourse, devastating. The internet promised to democratize knowledge. Instead, it democratized noise. The people who see clearly are still the 0.001%. They're just now surrounded by 10,000 times more people telling them to doubt themselves. For your own life, the question becomes, are you in the 0.001%? Not do you think you are? That's easy. But actually, when you see something clearly, do you act on it? Or do you understand it intellectually and then just go back to your life? I don't ask that to flatter you. I ask it because it's the test. The Fish concert didn't separate people by what they saw. Everyone saw the same thing. It separated them by what they did afterward. Okay? Most people did nothing. They went home. They told stories about that crazy night, and then they continued to live in exactly the same way. Maybe a few people, a tiny few, actually changed something. Let the experience restructure how they live, but that's the 0.001%. And here's the final uncomfortable question. If you're in a room where everyone agrees with you, if you found your people, your echo chamber, so to speak, ask yourself, are we agreeing because we've filtered for comfort or because we've filtered for the willingness to act? If it's the first, you might be in a bubble. If it's the second, you might just be right. And here's the thing, I'm not trying to make you feel special. I must be in the 0.001%. That's exactly the kind of comfortable self-flattery the thesis warns against. The point isn't to identify with the 0.001%. The point is to ask whether you're acting like them. Because here's what's true. Most people who watch this video will agree with parts of it, will nod along, will think, that's an interesting framework. And then most of them won't change a single thing. Not because they're bad people, not because they're stupid, but because acting is hard. Reorganizing your life around what you see is hard. Most people don't do it. The question is, it's not, do you understand this? The question is, what are you going to do about it? I wrote a novel about a group of people who asked that question. who stopped waiting for the world to catch up and started building for the people who were already there. It's called Origins. It's the first book in the Quamhoc Anomaly series. And if you've ever felt like you were seeing something clearly and no one else was acting on it, you might recognize something in these chapters. Links in the description. If you enjoyed this, please give a like and subscribe for more, as it helps keep this channel going. And thank you for watching.